Psykdesk patient accounting is basically made up of three components: charges, payments, and applied payments. Let's take a look at the charge. The charge, or the service charge, is made up of a rate, the number of units, which multiplied by the rate equals the total amount for that charge. And that charge will also be related to a service, which will have a CPT code associated with it. Now, the charge amount is broken up into two pieces. There's a patient responsibility and a payer amount. Patient responsibility is determined by billing setup and service setup. The payer amount is simply the total charge amount minus the patient responsibility. The payer amount is not necessarily the amount that the payer will actually pay. That amount will be based upon the contracted rate that you have with each payer. Payments record the collections of monies, and these could be in the form of credit card payments, electronic transfers, checks, etc. A payment will come from one of two sources. It will either be a patient payment coming from the patient, or it will be a payer payment coming from the payer. In Psykdesk, you indicate what charge a payment is for by allocating that payment to a particular charge. The balances on the Manage Billing section on the patient's chart are all about how payments are allocated to charges. Psykdesk records an allocation of a payment to a charge as an applied payment. We'll see how this works in detail in a bit. So let's take a look at the Manage Billing section of the patient's chart. On the top of the section is total patient and payer balances, and it will show you several balances depending upon the balances that exist. Below that are several tabs. Let's take a look at the Charges tab. The Charges tab will show you all of the charges for the patient, as well as any payments that have been allocated to the charge. So let's take a look at the first charge here. The charge is for data service 423. And if you click on the data service for that charge, you will navigate to the encounter for which that charge is attached. Let's go back. So moving to the right, I can see a description of the service for that charge, the CPT code for that charge, as well as the units and the diagnosis associated with that charge. I can also see the provider for that charge and the amount of that charge. Now, on the amount column, if I click on it, I will go to the charge details, and I can see some additional information about how that charge was created, as well as all the details behind it. Moving to the right, I move into the patient section of the charge, and this will show me the patient's responsibility for that charge. And then if I move to the right some more, this will be the payer section of that charge, and it's going to show me the payer amount for that charge. Now, like I said, in addition to the charges, this page will also show you any payments that have been allocated to those charges. So if I go to the second charge here, the one created on 4/18, I can see that there was a $25 payment allocated to the patient portion of this charge. And I can view that payment by clicking on it, and I can see the payment details. The other thing to mention is that there's also this balance section. So if I have a patient amount and no payments allocated to it, the balance will reflect the charge amount minus the payments applied to it. And in this case, since I have no payments, the balance is 25. In the charge below it, I have a patient responsibility of 25. A patient payment has been applied of $25, and so the balance is 0. This works the same way on the payer side. So down on 411, this charge had a payer balance of $265.52. a payment of $209.42 was applied to it with an adjustment of $56.10. And then the $265.52 minus what was paid and adjusted equals a balance of 0. And just like the patient payment, I can view the details of the payer payment by clicking on the payment in the paid column, and this will bring me to the payment page, and I can see all the details for that particular payment. In the payer section, I can also see any claims or invoices that were created in relation to this charge as part of the billing workflow, which will be used to collect the payment for that charge. So this first charge has a claim associated with it, and it's in a status of acknowledged, and I can click on that status to view the claim details. So let's take a look at the next tab in the Manage Billing section, which is the Payments tab. Now, this tab will show me all of the payments related to this patient, whether they have been allocated to a charge or not. And you can see it'll show you the payment date here. It'll show you the source of the payment, so whether it came from a payer or from a patient. It will show you if it came from a payer or who that payer was. It'll show you the type of payment, such as credit card, electric funds transfer. It'll show you the amount of the payment. And it'll also show you if that payment has created a credit. If you remember, a credit is created when the amount of a payment is not entirely allocated to a charge. So in this case, the payment was $50. $25 still is not allocated to a particular charge. So if you want to see what is creating a patient or payer credit balance, this is where you go to the Payments tab and you come under the credit column to see what is creating that balance. The next tab is the Transactions Simple tab, and this tab will show you all of the charges and payments in chronological order and how they add up to create these balances at the top of the Managed Billing page. So if I show all the transactions and scroll to the end, I can look at the balance section for the patient, and these are all the transactions that were added up to finally get a balance of $25, and that matches the $25 at the top here. The same thing for the patient credit balance. If I want to know what makes up that balance, I'll go to the patient's section, I'll go to the credit balance column, and here is all the history that leads up to the $85, which shows up in the patient's credit balance. And that's how all these balances work. You can just navigate to the appropriate column, in this case the payer balance, and you'll see all the changes that happened to that payer balance to get to the $122.08. The Transactions tab shows you the same thing as the Simple tab, except the Transactions tab will show all of the history and changes to each charge and payment in chronological order. So there'll be more details there to figure out how these balances were calculated and where they came from. Let's take a look at the Action menu on the Manage Billing section. So it's over here on the right-hand side, and there are several actions that are available here. You can create the patient payment here from clicking on that button. You can create a payer payment from here as well. You can create a patient refund if the patient has a credit balance to refund back to them. And you can create a payer refund if the payer has a credit balance to refund to them. You can create a credit for a patient without creating a payment. And then you can also create a write-off or an adjustment without creating a payment as well. Finally, this is where you can print a patient invoice as well as print a super bill. Let's review some of the balances that can appear at the top of the Manage Billing section and how they're calculated. So there are 6 balances that can appear at the top of the Manage Billing section on the patient's chart. 3 of which have to do with the patient section of the charge, and the other 3 have to do with the payer section of the charge. So on the patient side, there's the patient balance, the patient credit balance, and the patient over-allocated payment balance. On the payer side, there's a payer balance, payer credit balance, and payer over-allocated payment balance. The amounts that are calculated in each balance have everything to do with how payments are allocated to charges. And understanding how this allocation works is probably the most important concept to understand Psykdesk billing. So let's walk through how different allocations will create different balances. A patient balance is created when the patient responsibility on a charge is greater than the payments that have been applied to it. So in this case, the patient responsibility is $25. The patient has paid $20 and applied $20 to the patient responsibility, leaving a patient balance of $5. You'll also get a patient balance if the charge has a patient responsibility and no payments are applied to that charge. A patient credit balance will occur when the amount of the patient payment is greater than the amount that's applied to the patient responsibility section of the charge. So, for example, in this case, the patient paid $75. Only $25 was applied to the patient responsibility in the charge because that's all that they owed. And the rest, the $50, will show up as a patient credit balance. You can also create a patient credit balance when you have a patient payment that has not been applied to any charges. So in this case, the patient may have prepaid $75 that has not been applied to any charges yet, but will be applied to charges in the future. And finally, it is possible to create an over-allocated payment on the patient side of the charge. And this will occur when the amount of an applied payment is greater than the amount on the charge. So in this case, a $75 payment was applied to a $25 charge, creating a patient over-allocated payment of $50. Now this can occur, for example, when the patient responsibility was $75, but then a correction was made to the charge to lower it to $25 without updating the allocation. Payer balances work the same way as patient balances, except you'll be dealing with the payer amount on the charge and a payer payment. The amount of the payer payment works the same as the amount on the patient payment. However, the payer payment amount is considered in the context of the original amount that was requested to be paid, the patient responsibility, and an adjustment to indicate why the actual amount paid is less than the total amount requested minus the patient responsibility. In this case, the total amount of the charge was $250, $25 of which was owed by the patient, and the rest was billed to the payer. The payer received the claim, for example, to pay the $250. The payer calculated that the patient responsibility was $25, created an adjustment to lower the amount owed to be in line with the contracted amount for that particular service, and the difference is the $150. So when we create the payment, we apply the $150 plus the $75 adjustment to the $225 payer amount on the charge, which gives us a balance of 0 under payer balance. So with that understanding, let's go ahead and create a patient payment. So here's Jill again. She owes $25, and that $25 is from the 420 encounter. It's a patient responsibility is $25, and it's still outstanding. So I'm going to click Create a Patient Payment. We're going to use a credit card that's already on file. She owes $25. I'm going to enter the $25 here. And then that $25 will be automatically allocated on the patient payment by Psykdesk to the outstanding charge. So here is where it allocates that $25 to the charge, and I hit save. So now I've created that patient payment. It shows that it's paid, the balance is 0, and the total patient balance is now 0. Let's take a look at Jill Jones's patient credit balance and see if we can figure what's causing this credit balance. So if you remember, a patient credit balance is created when a patient payment is not completely allocated to a charge. The best way to see those payments is to go to the Payments tab and to come to this credit column. So I'm going to expand this out a little bit. And we can see that there has been 4 payments that are causing credits, which means they haven't been completely allocated to charges. So for example, there's been a $50 payment, $25 has not been allocated. Here's a $25 payment, the entire amount has not been allocated, and so forth and so on. If I want, I can click on the payment and see the details behind it. So there was a credit card transaction of $50. Only $25 was allocated to the 418 charge, which had a charge of $25, which caused it to deposit credit of $25, thus creating an addition to the total amount of the patient credit balance. Now, patients can pay for services using the funds from their credit balance. So for example, Jill now has $85 in her credit balance. I just created a new data service for 426, checked her in, which created a patient responsibility of $25. And now I'm going to pay for that service using funds from her credit account. So let's create a patient payment. Instead of selecting a type of credit card, I can say withdraw credit, $25. That $25 gets allocated to the charge and hit save. So now I've made a payment that the patient balance has now gone to 0 and her patient credit balance has gone down by the $25 which I used. Let's go ahead and create a payer payment for Jill Jones. Now, normally, payer payments will be created as part of posting ERAs that come in through the exchange. But there may be some scenarios where you're going to have to create the payer payment manually, and that's what we'll show you now. So to do that, we come to the Action menu on the Manage Billing section and select Create Payer Payment. I'll select the payer. I'm only going to get the payers that are set up for Jill Jones. I'm going to select the type. So in this case, I received a check. I can put the check number here if I want, as well as the payment date and the amount of the check. Now, it's also going to show me all of the open charges that are payer charges awaiting payment. So let's say I just received payment for the 410 charge, and the outstanding amount for that charge on the payer side is $255. I've already calculated that the patient responsibility is $25 and hopefully have already collected that patient responsibility from the patient. So let's enter the amount that the Aetna will actually pay. So let's say Aetna only paid $100 because that's the amount based upon the contracted rate. And then I want to allocate that $100 to this charge. Now I need to click out of that field for the calculations to occur. And the system automatically calculates that the adjustment should be $155 based upon the patient responsibility of $25, the amount paid of $100. I can take that adjustment of $155, which is going to make apply a payment of 100 plus 155, total of 255, which will close out this charge. So hit save. And let's go ahead and find the 410 data service charge. And here we can see that the payer owed 255.52. They paid 100. They made an adjustment of 155, and now the balance is 0. Let's take a look at a scenario where I calculated the patient's copay to be $25, collected that patient's copay, and then sended off the rest of the amount to be billed to their insurance via claim. And when that payer pays, the payer calculated the copay to be 0. So the payer said the patient does not owe anything. So let's take a look at how to record that payment and how Psykdesk will handle that. So normally this payment would be made by posting the ERA came back, but I'm going to show you how to create it manually. So I will go over to the Create Payer Payment. I'll select the payer, Aetna, and the amount in the check was $125. So now I'm going to allocate that $125 to this charge and take the adjustment. But the responsibility from the payer was not $25, it was 0. And my adjustment was actually $169.51. So that looks good. I'm going to process that and see what happens. So that created a payer overpaid charges balance as well as a negative payer balance. And this is because you've essentially collected the $25 twice from both the patient and the payer. The way to avoid this is that when you create the payment, let's go ahead and take a look at it. To make sure that you select Update Patient Responsibility on the charge if the responsibility from the payer is different from what you've calculated initially. This will update the patient responsibility on the charge and move what the patient paid into the credit balance automatically for you. So now let's take a look at what happens if I make that adjustment. So now we paid $125, which was the amount paid, and the adjustment of $169, which matches the information we got from the payer. We updated the charge patient responsibility to 0. And as a result, the payment, which was already collected by the patient, is now hitting their patient credit balance of $25, and that could be either refunded back to the patient or used for a future encounter. Let's take a look at this scenario where I created a charge, but it didn't have the correct patient responsibility. So in this case, I checked in Mickey for a neuro eval. The system calculated that the entire amount was billable to the payer and that the patient did not owe anything. But after I did some research, I found that the patient had a deductible and the patient had $200 left over in their deductible, and they owe that amount. So I'd like to update the charge to reflect that. So the way that I'll do that is I'll click on the charge. I'll edit the charge. I'll update the patient's responsibility to 200. So now I can see that here's the total amount, here's what the patient owes, and here's what the payer owes. I'll hit save. And now if I go back and look at that charge, the patient responsibility is now 200 and the rest is billable to the payer. Another way that I can correct the patient responsibility on a charge, if the encounter has not gone too far in the billing workflow, is to select the encounter which has the charge, to undo check-in. That will delete all the charges associated with that encounter, so it basically gets rid of everything. And then go to the patient under billing setup and edit the deductible amount that should be calculated on check-in. So here's the patient responsibility default amount of $200. I'll hit save. So now, when I go ahead and check in that particular encounter, the patient responsibility is calculated correctly based on billing setup. And if I go to the patient's chart, that looks good, and I've corrected that particular charge.